I've spent much of the past decade discussing the history of New York City and places such as Forgotten New York in my classes at Touro College and the book Hidden Waters of New York City. What many residents of New York City sometimes forget is that there's a bigger state to the north and east of New York City that shares the city's name. And in this video, I want to talk about the history of New York's state parks. New York is home to the nation's oldest state park at Niagara Falls, but it also celebrates the centennial of its state park agency, which was founded in 1924, presently known as the Office of Parks, Recreation, and Historical Preservation. The collection of state parks in New York is diverse. It includes places like Jones Beach, Bear Mountain, Minnewaska, Genesee River, Watkins Glen, Brooklyn Bridge Park, and so many more. Having previously made a video on the state parks of Long Island, I talked about the collection of parks connected by parkways designed to facilitate the arrival of city dwellers and suburbanites to these unique natural and recreational landscapes. I also talked about the state parks of New York City as that reminder of New York City being part of New York State. Places like Gantry Plaza, FDR Four Freedoms on Roosevelt Island, Roberto Clemente in the Bronx, Shirley Chisholm State Park in Brooklyn's Jamaica Bay, and Marsha P. Johnson State Park in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, all named after individuals who contribute to the history of their communities, the state, and the nation. Looking at a map of the regions of New York State within our 62 counties, this is a map from the Department of Environmental Conservation, the green marking DEC lands, and the reddish color marking state park lands. Large amount of the DEC lands is Adirondack Park on the sort of roof of New York with its highest point at Mount Marksey, and Catskill Park, where much of New York City's drinking water comes from. But here's a smaller map. This is a map of the state park regions, where the Hudson Valley is divided into two state park regions, Taconic on the left or east bank of the Hudson River, and Palisades on the west or right bank of the Hudson River. Today, I will talk about the parks of the Palisade region, beginning with parks that are closest to New York City and then continuing further north. The National Park Service map of the Hudson River Valley National Heritage Area stretches from Albany down to Yonkers on the Bronx border. That includes both sides of the Hudson River. And one of my favorite state parks here is Bear Mountain State Park. This is one of those flagship parks on a par with Niagara and Jones Beach, because there's so many things to do in this park and where I spent so much of my childhood. And the history of the Palisade region is closely connected to the Palisades Interstate Parkway, which opened in the 1920s. You can see here the ribbon cutting, the leaders of the states of New York and New Jersey, and the master planner, Robert Moses, standing humbly by the side, though we know he was responsible for so many of the city's parks and highways, as well as in the vicinity. There's a dog here, not sure whose dog it was. But one of the things about the Palisades Parkway is its scenery. As you drive from the George Washington Bridge to its northern terminus at Bear Mountain, you feel like you're traveling through an unspoiled landscape, the hills and the trees concealing what became suburbia beyond these trees. But the landscape designed to feel as if it has never changed. The Palisades Parkway, named after the Palisades Cliffs, nearly 250 million years old, these volcanic cliffs facing the Hudson River between Haverstraw and Jersey City, given its name by early European settlers for their resemblance to a palisade or fortified wall. Another great book about the Palisades Interstate Parks is Palisades, 100,000 Acres in 100 Years by Robert O. Benoist, that talks about John D. Rockefeller's contribution of purchasing land from the trap rock companies, the companies that were blowing up the cliffs to make for the city's building materials. Rockefeller felt that as these cliffs have stood the test of time for millions of years old, they should be preserved for future generations. The closest state park in the Palisades region to New York City is Tallman Mountain State Park, which was acquired in 1928 at 687 acres, with the highest point here, 218 feet. So more of a hill than a mountain, though it certainly has the mountainous scenery. In the 1930s, during the Great Depression, the federal government had the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC, hiring unemployed construction workers to develop public parks. And one of the jewels of this park is a swimming pool that overlooks the Piermont Marshes, a unique ecosystem where fresh and salt water mix in an estuary, a calm section of the Hudson River, buffeted from the current by the village of Piermont that sticks into the river, with views of the Tappan Zee Bridge, its name for the Tappan natives, and the word zee, Dutch for lake, Tappan Zee, from the Tallman Mountain State Park. You can see the earlier pictures of Tallman Mountain when this pool just opened, as well as photos of the trap rock being blown up before it was saved from further destruction. This is Tallman Mountain State Park on the Piermont Marshes, facing opposite the villages of Ardsley on Hudson, Dobbs Ferry, and Tarrytown. Blauvelt State Park is the next state park continuing north, acquired by the state in 1913 at 639 acres. It got its Dutch name Blauvelt from Camp Bluefields, a large rifle range used primarily to train members of the New York National Guard. As you hike through these woods, you'll find graffiti-covered building remnants from the time when this was a training camp. So a bit of art and nature coexisting. After being a National Guard training camp, it served as a WCA summer camp for New York City's working women, then as an ROTC training camp, Columbia University summer camp, as a destination for participants of the Fresh Air Fund that brought working class children from the inner city to experience nature. Often you see the donation ad for the Fresh Air Fund appearing in the New York Times. In 1930, the camp resumed military use by the U.S. Army, using it for training programs. 1942, it was known as Camp Shanks, used as a training ground and an air raid post during World War II before reverting back to use as a parkland. This is Blauvelt. The next state park continuing north is Rockland Lake State Park, which is connected to Hook Mountain State Park, Nyack Beach State Park, and Haverstraw Beach State Park. The Nyack Beach State Park was acquired in 1911 at 61 acres. Formerly used as a beach, but as the river became more polluted by the 1950s, swimming was discontinued, though you can still admire the water on the edge and go canoeing here at Nyack Beach, named after the neighboring town of Nyack. The former powerhouse of the Trap Rock Company became a bathhouse. Today, that's a visitor center. And nearby, there was a dock where boats brought in visitors from New York City on the Hudson River steamship line that went up to Bear Mountain. Hook Mountain State Park, also acquired in 1911 at 676 acres, topping out at 689 feet. Hook Mountain was known to the Dutch settlers of the region as Ver der Tiege Hoek, meaning tedious point. Why the reference to laziness? Perhaps as sailors rounded this bend in the Hudson River, the fact that they could see that mountain for a long period of time gave it the name Tedious Hook. From the skyscrapers of Manhattan, you look north and you see a bend in the Hudson River. That is Hook Mountain. It was also known on some Dutch maps as Diedrich Hook, perhaps after a local landowner. On the views of Hook Mountain, you could see the cliff face that was blown off by the Trap Rock companies before this became a state park. There's also a painting of Hook Mountain by Edward Hopper, the master of loneliness, who was a resident of Nyack. And in Nyack, there is an Edward Hopper House Museum dedicated to this local son. You can see here is also historical pictures of what Nyack Beach and Hook Mountain looked like when swimming was permitted here. And since the Clean Air Act passed in the 1970s, the water quality in the Hudson River has greatly improved. And there is talk every once in a while about reviving swimming at Nyack Beach and Hook Mountain. Rockland Lake State Park. This large inland kettle pond was acquired by the state in 1958 at 1,333 acres and a height of 148 feet, the water level of Rockland Lake. Known to natives as Quash Peak Pond, it was acquired by Knickerbocker Ice Company. In 1831, Rockland Lake became known as the Ice House of New York City, with a reputation for having the cleanest and purest ice in the area. During the 1850s, the Knickerbocker Ice Company operated a dozen steamboats, 75 ice barges, and employed 3,000 people. Ice harvest typically began in January, and blocks of ice were stored in large ice houses before being shipped to customers during warmer weather. The ice houses, insulated with sawdust, could store up to 50,000 tons of ice, brought down to the Hudson River on a runway that resembled a rail track. The Knickerbocker Ice Company closed in 1924, and the park was developed with two swimming pools, one on the north side of the lake, one on the south side of the lake, with no swimming in the lake. In 2018, the north pool was given water slides as an additional public amenity. Haverstraw Beach State Park to the north of Rockland Lake also is on the water's edge along the Palisade Cliffs. Haverstraw Beach was at only 73 acres, also acquired in 1911. And in there, as you hike through the waterfront trail, you'll see a sign by the Historical Society of Rockland County called the Treason Site. It was there on September 22nd, 1780. The American General Benedict Arnold had crossed over to the British side with plans of the West Point fortress, where he met with British Major John Andre, hoping that with his plans, the British would capture West Point and resume their plan of marching north on the Hudson River to Canada, dividing the rebellious colonies. He was captured, convicted, and hanged as a spy nearby in the village of Tappan in 1780. Benedict Arnold's name has since been synonymous with traitor and treason, and it took place at Haverstraw Beach State Park. High Tor State Park to the north of Haverstraw Beach is where the Palisades Cliffs turn to the north and then the west. High Tor State Park was acquired in 1934 at 691 acres and a summit elevation of 797 feet. High Tor State Park in the 1920s and 30s was famous for a Broadway play that became a movie by Maxwell Anderson called High Tor. It deals with the story of Elmer Van Orden, a fifth-generation descendant of Dutch settlers who refused to sell his property to the trap rock companies, believing in the beauty of this landscape and the right to his property. When he died in 1942 at age 79, he had no children, and the land was bequeathed to the public. So this is the legacy of Elmer Van Orden. And this park, there's also a swimming pool, but unlike Tallman Mountain, no views of the cliff concealed by the vegetation at High Tor State Park. Stony Point Battlefield State Historic Site. Stony Point is the rocky outcropping sticking out to the Hudson River with its own lighthouse at an elevation of just 150 feet. Nicknamed the Little Gibraltar because there's a rock sticking out into a strategic waterway. By 1779, the British were losing the war, having been defeated at Saratoga in 1777. And in that year, General Anthony Wayne, nicknamed Mad Anthony Wayne for his temper, attacked the British fortress at Stony Point, defeating the Redcoats, forcing them to retreat further south to New York City. Anthony Wayne later led wars against the Native Americans in Indiana and Michigan, and became a slave plantation owner in the South. But much of his reputation began here at Stony Point, with its memorial arch entrance to the point on the Hudson River. Bear Mountain State Park. In 1913, there were plans by Sing Sing Prison to expand their facilities onto Bear Mountain. Opposition came from local property owners and wealthy philanthropists who recognized this unique landscape just to the south of the West Point Military Academy on a bend in the Hudson River. It is 5,277 acres and 1,293 feet at the summit of Bear Mountain. In 1913, the Bear Mountain Inn was founded by George W. Perkins on the site of the proposed jail, with its Adirondack rustic-style architecture, one of the few state parks where you could sleep inside the park in a hotel. And with each day, do the different things, whether it's the trailside museums and zoo. The lowest point on the Appalachian Trail is within the grounds of the zoo, as the trail passes through the park. It has a swimming pool inside a valley, carved into the valley, an observation tower on top of Bear Mountain, hiking trails, Hessian Lake with its boat rentals, and the Bear Mountain Bridge crossing onto the east side of the Hudson River. During the Revolutionary War, a small fort within the Trailside Museum, Fort Montgomery, had experienced pitched battles between the British allied Hessians from Germany and the local patriots. On top of the Bear Mountain is the Perkins Memorial Tower, because if it doesn't feel tall enough, make it feel a little bit taller with this observation tower built out of locally sourced stones and named in memory of Perkins. The mountain also used to have a ski jump in its early years that was later discontinued. 1970s, the hotel was given a modernist look, but then in the late 90s, restored back to its original rustic appearance. Next to Bear Mountain is Iona Island, Iona Island is a separate state park acquired in 1965 to 134 acres, formerly used as a munitions depot, and later becoming a nature preserve. This is Bear Mountain, where I had so many picnics with my parents as a child. To learn more about the history of Bear Mountain, the Palisades Parks Conservancy has short documentary videos on YouTube, including the 100th anniversary of the Bear Mountain Inn, the story of George W. Perkins, called The Perkins Effect, and the story of Edward Harriman, the philanthropist responsible for the preservation and expansion of Bear Mountain State Park and its adjoining park, Harriman State Park. Every good park deserves a conservancy group for that extra boost of philanthropic and volunteer support. You could also learn about the history of state parks at the New York State Parks Historic Sites blog for pictures of the past and the present and plans for the future of the state park. So I strongly recommend the blog from the social media division of our state parks agency. I wish every park had its own documentary. But until then, I hope you enjoy this video presentation that I have. The Hudson River is also famous for the Hudson River School. It's not a school, it's a group of artists who lived around the same time as each other and learned from each other. And some of the state parks appeared in paintings that predated the state parks, but created that early encouragement towards the preservation of these unique landscapes as railroads and steamboats and urbanization encroached on them. The paintings you see here include Storm King Mountain by Samuel Coleman from 1866, Tappan Zee by Francis Augustus Silva in 1876, Minnewaska by Daniel Huntington in 1889, Bear Mountain, Iona Island by David Johnson in 1872. You can also see a painting of Hook Mountain by Sanford Robinson in 1866, and Hook Mountain by James Augustus Sidable, a descendant of Dutch settlers, painted in 1863. A lot of great books about the Hudson River School, such as American Paradise, Hudson River, and American Wilderness. Eventually, perhaps tired of the Hudson River, the painters of the Hudson River School moved on to places like Yellowstone, the Yosemite, the Rocky Mountains, and then into Latin America, preserving these landscapes in painting. And there's a Hudson River School art trail established by the Olana Museum, where you could follow the landscapes and see how similar or how different they look since they were painted. Continuing back to our tour, we now go on to Harriman State Park, the big one here, acquired in 1910 by the Harriman family at 47,527 acres, with its highest point being Black Rock Mountain, 1,381 feet. Still shorter than the Empire State Building and the World Trade Center, but tall enough that you could see those buildings from these summits. Harriman State Park includes the Seven Lakes Drive, which is the New York version of the Blue Ridge Parkway, going along a ridge past some of these picturesque lakes. It includes campgrounds and 3 lakes, Welch, Teorati, and Sebago, that were developed as beaches with sand brought in from the ocean. Teorati is the small one, Lake Welch is the big one, but the biggest one, Lake Sebago Beach, not to be confused with Lake Sebago in the state of Maine, was abandoned following damage from Hurricane Irene in 1911, though in her State of the State address in early 2024, New York Governor Kathy Hochul outlined a vision of reviving Lake Sebago Beach in Harriman State Park. Edward Harriman and Mary Averill Harriman owned 30,000 acres in Arden, New York as part of their estate. They opposed the state's decision to build a prison at Bear Mountain. They wanted to donate some of their land to the state to build this park. But controversially, part of the acquisition for the park included displacing some of the small villages and residents who lived in these mountains, most famously Doodletown, located within Bear Mountain State Park. We can still find a small cemetery and a church that used to be part of a village there. A year after the death of her husband in 1909, Mary Harriman proposed to donate 10,000 acres of land. That was the beginning of Harriman State Park. Her son, W. Averill Harriman, later became a governor and a diplomat, a big booster and supporter of these state parks. Indeed, the descendants of people like Perkins and Harriman continued to be active in the preservation and maintenance of these parks. By the way, the music you hear in the background, that is Appalachian Spring by New York-based classical composer Aaron Copland. Very fitting for this video. Continuing on, You can see here a book called Ramapo Mountain People, descendants of natives and Dutch settlers and freed slaves who had lived in the isolation of these mountains, maintaining their unique dialects and traditions way into the 20th century. And you can see here pictures of the campgrounds, the ocean-like beach, but without the waves, the freshwater beach. And this is the closest public freshwater beach to New York City, the Seven Lakes of Harriman State Park. Storm King State Park, originally nicknamed by the Dutch as Butter Mountain because it looked like a loaf of butter as the sailors circled around it. Acquired in 1922 at 1,972 acres and a summit of 1,348 feet. Storm King Mountain was given its name in the 19th century by renowned writer Nathaniel Parker Willis, who felt it was a much more poetic name than Butter Mountain, or Butterberg, as it was known by the Dutch. Edward Stillman, a prominent physician in early 20th century New York City, owned land around Storm King Mountain, and it was he who donated it to the public to be forever preserved. In the 1960s, Con Edison proposed a power plant carved into Storm King Mountain, an intrusion on this landscape that launched an environmental movement to prevent the power plant as a unique striped bass spawning ground and scenery. And so the power plant was preserved. Storm King was saved, in large part to a local woman named Frances Reese, or Franny Reese, who we'll talk about much later. This is Storm King Mountain. Scunnamunk State Park, a Dutch spelling of a native name, located further inland, closer to the New York State Thruway, or Interstate 87, on the borders of the towns of Woodbury, Cornwall, and Blooming Grove. This is a conglomerate mountain, a rock that's a composition of different types of igneous and sedimental and metamorphic rocks, with small waterfalls and creeks within, a railroad viaduct that goes flat across a valley at the park's northern side, and was also appeared in a painting by Sylvia Plimack Mangold, made in 1980. That's part of the Metropolitan Museum collection, an ink drawing called Scunnamunk Mountain. That's part of the Taconic region with views here of the Hudson Highlands. Goose Pond Mountain State Park, deeper inland. It's located along State Route 17, which is also known as Interstate 86. Route 17 is the road to the Catskills that for generations of New Yorkers going to the bungalow colonies and hotels in the Catskills, they took Route 17. This park was acquired in 1960 at 1,706 acres and a summit elevation of 1,066 feet. Goose Pond Mountain is mostly a nature preserve. There's very little public access to it except for a small hiking trail around a wetland pond close to Route 17. The park's nature trails were developed during the upgrade of the state highway to an interstate, a project in long time coming, as Route 17 connects the western tip of New York on the Pennsylvania border near Lake Erie to the Hudson Valley region near the town of Harriman. Highland Lake State Park, located close to Interstate 84, that spans from Connecticut through the Hudson Valley towards Pennsylvania. Highland Lake State Park was acquired in 1964 at 3,115 acres and a summit elevation of 705 feet. There's no bathroom, there's no visitor or nature center here. The only accommodation there is here for the public is a small unpaved parking lot near the park's northern side. The rest of the park is open for your exploration. No trash receptacles either. What you bring in, you got to carry out, as is the rule in most of these nature preserves. This is Highland Lake State Park. Lake Superior State Park, not to be confused with the Great Lake. This is Lake Superior that's managed by Sullivan County Parks, but officially it's a state-owned park. So I couldn't find a state park map of the park. And by the way, all of these state parks maps are made by the company Avanza. They are as iconic to New York State Park Agency as the black and white brochures are to the National Park Service. So I like the fact that almost all the state parks have these identically designed maps that make you understand that this is a state park, that they're all connected by a common design, but not by Lake Superior State Park, part of which is a no hunting area, part of which is for archery, and part of it open to hunting with permits. It includes a swimming beach on Lake Superior and a smaller Chestnut Ridge Pond. Lake Superior is 1,410 acres managed by Sullivan County. Franny Reese State Park, named after preservationist and conservationist Francine Reese, located opposite of the city of Poughkeepsie, home to Vassar College. From Franny Reese State Park, you can see the Mid-Hudson Bridge, and further north, the walkway over the Hudson State Park. It's near Route 9W, the smaller and older version of the New York Thruway. 9W is the successor to colonial roads and native trails that ran between New York and Albany on the west side of the Hudson River. Franny Reese State Park was only acquired recently in 2009 at 251 acres, formerly known as the Cedar Glen Estate of painless dentistry pioneer Charles H. Roberts of the 19th century. Disagreements by his heirs resulted in long, protracted legal battles and the abandonment of the property as nature reclaimed it. So among the nature, there are ruins in Franny Reese State Park, named after a deserving woman and pioneer in the preservation movement of nature in the Hudson Valley. Walkway over the Hudson State Park is officially part of the Taconic region, but it connects to the Palisades region. The walkway over the Hudson was acquired also in the year 2009 at just 17 acres, 212 feet. This is the New York State or upstate version of the High Line that you have in Manhattan, an abandoned railway trestle that operated from the mid-19th century until 1975, and then abandoned and preserved as a walkway over the Hudson. The Hudson River here is at sea level, but you are walking above it at 212 feet above its average tide. Walkway over the Hudson. Sojourner Truth State Park, formerly a quarry site where rocks were carved out of the land to create building materials. And then there was fear that this would become a development site for more tract housing. But the unique landscape here resulted in a preservation movement on the border of the towns of Ulster and Kingston, just north of Kingston, which was briefly the capital of New York State during the American Revolution. It was named after Sojourner Truth. She was born here when slavery was still the law in the Hudson River Valley. Her first language was Dutch, because long after the Dutch had given New Netherlands to the English in 1664 and became New York, Dutch long remained the language of the Hudson Valley, similar to how Quebec continued to speak French after the English had took it over. Sojourner Truth spoke Dutch. She had escaped from slavery just before slavery ended in New York, fearful that she could be sold down south. She was a conductor in the Underground Railroad, helping other slaves escape captivity, and became a pioneer for the women's suffrage movement, that women should also have the right to property and to vote and to equal pay to men. And so, because she had lived in this area and was born nearby, she knew these hills. And so, to give a nod to women's history and Black history, New York Governor Kathy Hochul had named this park Sojourner Truth State Park around 2022. It's 508 acres and takes up a portion of the Empire State Trail designated by her predecessor, Andrew Cuomo. The Empire State Trail runs from the Battery Park in New York City north to the Canada border and west to Niagara Falls. Sojourner Truth State Park. Inside Sojourner Truth Park, there are signage telling you about the altered landscapes, the abandoned buildings of the quarry, and the more recent pavilions for the public. In her 2024 State of the State address, Governor Kathy Hochul spoke about putting in a floating swimming pool inside one of the quarry ponds, of expanding swimming opportunities at New York State parks, and including Sojourner Truth State Park as part of that vision of public swimming in the parks. Minnewaska State Park, rivaling Bear Mountain as a destination park, it has a lot of young visitors being close to the college town of New Paltz. Minnewaska was acquired by the state in 1987 at 22,279 acres, expanded since 1987 thanks to public-private philanthropy that acquired adjoining parcels. Minnewaska's highest point is 2,244 acres. Throughout much of the 19th and 20th century, it was known for its mountain houses. Similar to the Mahonk Mountain House, a luxury hotel on a property next to the state park. Minnewaska had its own mountain houses, which gradually were either abandoned or went out of business. One of them burned down. And so, even though there's no mountain houses today on the cliff sides of Lake Minnewaska and Lake Awasting, it is a nature reclaimed. Here you could find a waterfall, a public beach, and a nature center built by the state. It is a hiker's paradise with its cliffs overlooking the Hudson Valley and the Shawangunk Mountains that run through Minnewaska State Park. The final state park that I'll talk about in the Taconic region of the Hudson River Valley is Sterling Forest State Park on Greenwood Lake on the border of New Jersey, close to the New York State Thruway and not too far from Harriman State Park. Sterling Forest State Park was known in the 19th century for its Sterling Furnace. This is where metallurgy took place in the colonial and early independence periods. And during the American Revolution, the metal extracted from these rocks was used to create a chain that was stretched across the Hudson River at West Point to prevent British battleships from going further north. The remnants of the Sterling Furnace can be found deep in the forest of this state park. Sterling Forest also has a place in Black history because it was here in 1919 that the Sterling Forest Farms Corporation was acquired as the first African-American vacation community in New York State. As the Catskills were known for the Jewish community, Sterling Forest was known to the African-American community, especially during the Harlem Renaissance, when many of the creative people from Upper Manhattan would vacation in the nature of Sterling Forest. And continue that way into the 60s and 70s, and preserved today for its role in Black history. But Sterling Forest also has a very beautiful nature center with a 3D model of the park's terrain. Next to Sterling Forest, by the way, is also the New York Renaissance Fair with its medieval summer community of people in costumes. And next to it was also the Sterling Forest ski area, which used to be the closest public ski hill to New York City. Sadly, it went out of business in the early 2000s, greatly missed, but hopefully somebody would revive it. But it is outside the state park, though enveloped by the state park, the Renaissance Fair and the former ski area, which I also remember from my childhood. Though nearby is Mount Peter, which is still in business, close to Sterling Forest State Park. As I mentioned, within the Sterling Forest, a very beautiful nature center. A lot of New York's state park nature centers are inspired by the Adirondack Park lodges and the Bear Mountain Inn, using natural materials for the architecture. Within the park is also a fire observation tower, from a time when people climbed these towers to observe for potential fires, and the Daughters of the American Revolution, a nonprofit group created by descendants of the revolution, put up a marker in the park to remember that the iron from this park was used to create the chain across the Hudson River. This is Sterling Forest State Park. For my next video, in this year of the centennial of New York State Parks, I will talk about the parks on the east side of the Hudson River, connected by the Taconic State Parkway. Iconic places like the Rockefeller State Park Preserve, the Old Croton Aqueduct Trail, a linear park, also could be comparable to the High Line, that begins at this beautiful dam and man-made cascade at the Croton Reservoir, Taconic Parkway, and the Hudson Highlands Park with its popular Breakneck Ridge will all be featured in my next video. I hope you've enjoyed